The wind howled across the frozen plain, not like a song but like a warning, long and low and endless. It rushed over jagged ice ridges and buried valleys, sweeping snow into the air in thick, blinding sheets. The sky above was a solid mass of gray. No stars, no sun, just a storm stretching from one horizon to the other. Cale Draven trudged forward, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet, his gloved hands clenched tight around the sled rope dragging behind him. The scanner on his chest blinked amber, warning of dropping temperature and rising wind speed. But he already knew. He could feel it in his bones. Behind him, Lyra cursed under her breath as another gust nearly knocked her sideways. Her med pack rattled with every step. Beside her, Rex grumbled something about frostbite and bad luck. But no one had the energy to laugh. The storm was too loud, the cold too deep. This was not how the mission was supposed to go. They had come to the glacier to collect seismic data for a long-dead corporation. Nothing heroic, nothing dangerous. Just readings, coordinates, samples. Now they were 3 days past the evac point, out of drone range, and the comms were dead. No signal, no direction, just white. Kyle raised a hand and the others stopped. He knelt in the snow, brushing aside the fresh powder, trying to read the terrain beneath. Something felt off. Not danger, not quite. But strange. Then he saw it. A shape just beneath the surface. A curve that did not belong to ice. He scraped faster, heart suddenly thudding. The snow gave way to crystal, a surface too smooth to be natural, too clean to be stone. He wiped it with his sleeve. A hand, frozen, delicate. Pale silver-blue skin pressed against the ice from underneath, fingers curled inwards like they had once held something. It was not human. He stumbled back, breath catching in his throat. "Cale," Lyra called. "What is it?" He couldn't answer. She knelt beside him and saw it. Her eyes widened. Rex dropped down next, blinking through the snow. "No way," he said. That's a person." Kyle was already moving. He pulled the portable heater from his pack and set it against the ice. The machine whined to life, its small red light casting a glow over the frozen figure below. Slowly, as the frost began to melt, more details emerged. A face, closed eyes, hair like threads of starlight tangled in frost. She looked like she had fallen asleep, not like she had been buried alive. "Alien," Rex muttered. "Definitely alien. Look at the markings on her skin. Those lines, they're not tattoos. They're alive." "Is she breathing?" Lyra asked. Cale checked the scanner. A flicker. Weak. But there. "She's alive," he whispered. "Barely." They all stared at each other. No one moved. The storm howled louder, and the wind clawed at their suits. "We can't leave her here," Cale said. Lyra nodded, already pulling out the insulated blanket. "Help me lift her." Rex hesitated. "Are we sure that's smart?" Cale looked at him. "Are we sure anything is anymore?" Together they dug her free, careful, slow, respectful. Her body was lighter than expected. Her skin was ice cold, but her pulse, if it could be called that, throbbed faintly beneath the surface. Kyle wrapped her in every layer of insulation they had and pressed his own heater against her side. "She needs warmth," Lyra said. "Not just outside, inside." Kyle didn't think. He unzipped his suit halfway and pressed her body against his chest, sharing heat, shielding her from the wind. She didn't react. "Let's find shelter," Rex said. They turned toward the nearest ridge. Then she moved. Just barely. Her lips parted, and a single word escaped in a voice like frost breaking on glass. "Run." The wind stopped. The scanner on Cale's chest turned red. And from the distance, through the swirling wall of snow, came a sound they had not heard before. Not the wind, not the storm. Something bigger. Something waking up. They ran. The storm had changed. It no longer howled. It hunted. Snow rose in waves that slammed against them like fists, and the wind now carried a sound beneath it, deeper than the storm's voice. A rhythm. Heavy. Measured. Approaching. Kale tightened his grip around the alien girl's body. Her skin was still ice-cold despite the layers, her breath shallow against his chest. She hadn't spoken again since that single word. Run. But she didn't need to. Something primal in Kale's bones knew she had not been warning for herself, but for them. Lyra ran just ahead, her visor cracked from a fall she hadn't even mentioned, her boots crunching deep into the snow. Rex brought up the rear, muttering curses between gasps, rifle in hand though it would be useless against anything that moved like what they'd heard. A flash of shadow moved across the sky, too fast to be cloud, too silent to be bird. Kyle looked up but saw nothing. The snow swallowed everything more than 10 feet away. We need shelter, Lyra shouted over the wind. Now. There, Kyle called back, pointing toward a rocky slope barely visible through the blizzard, a crease in the terrain that might hide a cave. They reached it moments later, clawing through snow and ice, ducking beneath an overhang of rock that barely shielded them from the storm. Inside, the temperature dropped even further, but it was dark and dry. It would have to do. Kale lowered the girl gently onto the rock floor, cradling her body in the blankets. Lyra was already pulling out her med kit. Rex scanned the entrance, then the sky, then the snow behind them. There's something out there, he said. I saw it. Legs too long, shoulders too high, like a tower that walked. We saw nothing, Kale replied. We heard it, Rex growled. And she said run. Whatever she is, she knew it was coming. Kale turned to Lyra. Can you help her? She's not built like us, Lyra said, frowning over her scanner. Her heart's slow. Brain activity's strange, but something's happening. There's energy inside her. Not electricity, not chemistry, like light. Kyle stared at the girl. The glow beneath her skin was faint, like embers trapped beneath frost. Veins of soft gold pulsed across her collarbones, up the side of her neck, disappearing beneath silver-white hair. Maybe that's how she survived under the ice, Lyra added. She froze herself. Rex shook his head. Why would she bury herself? Kyle looked at the entrance, where wind screamed past like something angry. Maybe she wasn't hiding, he said. Maybe she was hiding something else. A deep rumble rolled beneath the stone. Not thunder. Not quake. Closer. Kyle stood. Get ready. Rex raised his rifle. Then, from the snow outside, a shadow passed again. Closer, slower. The girl opened her eyes. Kyle fell to one knee beside her. Her lips moved, barely. Her voice was dry, weak. Coming. What is? Kale asked gently. She blinked slowly. Her gaze met his for the first time. Hunters? Outside, the wind dropped for half a second, and in that silence came a new sound. A single, echoing thud. Then another. Not footfalls, not machines. Something between. Kale turned back to the others. If we stay here, we die. Where do we go? Lyra asked. Kyle looked down at the girl, still shivering, still glowing faintly. He lifted her again, carefully. We move. She knows the way. Lyra and Rex hesitated, then followed. The storm closed behind them. And in the distance, far behind the wind, something breathed. Not animal, not machine. A sound like memory, like judgment. They made it to the second shelter just as the world began to crack. A narrow cave hidden beneath a collapsed ice ridge, just enough space for the three of them and the girl. It offered no comfort, but it offered cover. And out here, that was everything. Kale set the alien girl down near the back wall, careful not to jar her. She was still barely conscious, her eyes fluttering open only to close again like the light was too much. The glow beneath her skin had dimmed to a pale gold, thin and uncertain. She looked fragile, hollowed. And yet, something about her presence made the cold feel less final. Lyra crouched beside her, checking vitals with half-broken gear and quiet urgency. Rex stood near the entrance, rifle raised, staring out into the swirling white. They're close, he said. We don't know that, Kyle replied, unconvincing even to himself. I do, Rex snapped. I can feel them. It's like the storm has a heartbeat now. Kyle turned to Lyra. Can we move her again? Lyra shook her head. Number her body's metabolizing heat from the core outward. If we keep moving her, she might crash. Kale looked at the flickering flame in the center of the cave. It was barely holding on, just a few scraps of fuel and a repurposed torch unit. But even that tiny fire was a kind of miracle in the ice. He took off his outer coat and laid it over the girl's form. She didn't react. But when his hand brushed her shoulder, something strange happened. A spark. Not physical, not visual. Inside, Kale inhaled sharply. A pulse had passed through him, like her heartbeat had synced with his for half a second. He felt her. Not just the weight of her body, but something deeper. A memory of falling. A whisper of stars. A loneliness so wide it felt planetary. He stepped back, breath unsteady. Lyra saw the change in his face. What is it? I don't know, Kyle muttered. It felt like a scream shattered the cave. Not from her. Outside, Rex was at the opening in a flash. We've got movement, West Ridge. It's tall, and it's not walking. It's gliding. Kyle grabbed his rifle. Positions, now. Lyra turned the girl gently and propped her against the rock, wrapping more insulation around her shoulders. She won't survive if they get in. Kyle knelt at the edge of the cave mouth, rifle aimed. Rex flanked him. For a long moment, nothing but snow. Then, figures. 3. Towering, elongated limbs. No feet. They hovered just above the surface like ghosts of broken statues. No eyes, no faces. Just black exoskeletons laced with red seams. They moved slowly, but with purpose. Kyle's finger tightened on the trigger. Wait, Rex whispered. Listen. The wind had gone silent, and then the first one opened its mouth. A sound came out. It wasn't a scream. It was a word, not in any language Kale knew, but it struck something in him. A frequency that vibrated bone. It felt like grief sharpened into shape. Lyra gasped. They're calling her. The girl stirred. Kale turned. Elari, he said, trying the name they had seen etched into the tag on her collar. Elari, wake up! Her eyes opened, glowing again, but not gold. Now, silver white. Cold fire. Her lips parted. They found me, she whispered. You should leave. Kyle knelt beside her. Not happening. I was marked, she said. Before I was frozen. They're here to finish it. Then they'll have to go through us, Rex called from the front. The creatures moved closer. Kyle turned to Elari. Can you do anything? Anything at all? I have one thing, she said, but it costs everything. Don't give everything, Kale said. Just give me a chance. He turned back to the cave mouth. Rex fired the first shot. The round hit the nearest creature in the chest. It staggered, but didn't fall. It screeched, the sound curving through the air like blades. Kale fired next. Then, Lyra joined with a flare launcher, sending bursts of heat light into the snow. It wasn't enough. The creatures kept coming. Until light, blinding, not from the flare, from her. Elari stood now, weak, shaking, but radiant. She raised her hand, and from her palm, a ripple of light burst forth, a dome of silver flame that wrapped around the cave like a shield. The first creature hit it, and was thrown back like paper in a storm. The others stopped, studying her. Kyle stared. She was breathing hard, but she was standing. I can hold them, she whispered, but not forever. Kyle stepped beside her. You don't have to, just long enough. And for the first time, her fingers reached for his, and he took them. The shield pulsed brighter. The fire burned warmer. And the storm, for just one breath, felt like it was holding its breath. The wind outside beat against the glowing barrier like a fist of snow and sound. But inside the cave, there was stillness. Not peace. Not yet. Just breathe. Flickering light. And silence too heavy to ignore. Elari had collapsed moments after raising the shield. She now lay curled near the back wall, body trembling, her glowing veins dimmer than before. The pulse Kale had felt from her earlier was weaker now, like a candle fighting against the tide. Kale knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers gently to her neck. Faint. But there. She's alive, he said, voice low. For now, Lyra added, her brow furrowed as she scanned the girl's vitals with a shaky hand. Whatever that was, she gave too much. She protected us, Kyle said. She barely knows us, Rex replied. Why would anyone do that? The words hung in the air. No one answered them. Not yet. Lyra looked at Kale. If she collapses again, I don't know if I can bring her back. Kale didn't respond. He was staring at Alari's face, pale, calm, but not peaceful. Her lips moved slightly, as if caught in a dream she couldn't escape. Then she whispered something. Not in English, not in any language Kale recognized. But he felt it, like a shiver in the back of his mind. She's saying something, he murmured. Night talk, Lyra said softly. It's what patients sometimes do under deep trauma. Half conscious, part memory, part reflex. Kyle leaned closer. I don't think she's dreaming. Suddenly, Alari's eyes opened. Bright, silver, sharp. Her hand flew up, gripping Kale's wrist, not hard, not violent, but desperate. Don't let them touch me, she whispered. Please, if they touch me, I'd disappear. Kale froze. Who? But she was already fading again. Her grip loosened. Then she did something none of them expected. She sat up. Her body shook, legs still unsteady, but she pushed herself upright with effort that looked like pain. She turned her eyes on all 3 of them. You need to let me go, she said. No, Kyle replied, too quickly. Her voice shook. You don't understand. They don't stop. Ever. If you stay near me, they'll mark you too. You'll be hunted like I am. We already are, Rex muttered. Lyra stepped forward. You don't have to do this alone. Ilari shook her head. I was made to be alone. No one is made for that, Kale said. Ilari looked at him. You don't know what I carry. Then tell us, he said. Please. Let us choose for ourselves. Ilari hesitated, then stood. Her breath came in short bursts. Her legs trembled. But she stepped toward the wall of the cave. She reached out, and light bloomed from her palm. A tear opened in the air. A gate. Flickering. Alive. Leading to somewhere else. It pulsed like a heartbeat. A portal, Lyra whispered. She can leave. Ilari stared into it. Her eyes shimmered. I can be safe there, she said. No one else will suffer. No more blood. No more hunters. Just silence. Kale stepped forward. And if you go, who remembers you? She looked at him, startled. I do, he said. We do. Lyra stepped beside him. So stay, she said. Rex sighed and walked over too. Damn it, he muttered. We're not much of a rescue party, but we're stubborn. Ilari stared at them. 3 humans, flawed, fragile, unarmed, afraid, and still, here. She raised a hand slowly, touched her fingers to Kale's chest, then to Lyra's shoulder, then to Rex's arm. Her voice was quiet, barely a breath. I stay. The portal behind her shimmered once, then closed. She swayed. Kale caught her before she fell, and in the faint glow from her skin, the pulse had returned. Stronger now, not alone. Snow fell slower now, not because the storm had eased, but because something else was moving through it. Large, coordinated, alive in a way that ice should never be. Kyle felt it first, a pressure in his ears, a tremor beneath the soles of his boots. Then a long, low sound echoed from the ridge above their shelter. Not a roar. A signal. He turned to Ilari, who sat near the wall, her eyes half open, glowing faintly again. They're here, aren't they? He asked. She nodded. More than before. Stronger. They think I've chosen. Chosen what? She met his gaze. Chosen not to run. Rex cursed softly, checking the last of their supplies. 2 flares, 1 half-charged energy pack, and my rifle, which I may as well throw at them. Kale looked at Lyra. She was crouched beside a map drawn crudely into the ice floor, lines and marks etched with a knife. "If we hold them here," she said, "it'll be suicide." "If we run," Kyle replied, "they'll chase." Lyra turned to Ilari. "What do they want from you? Why are they hunting you?" Ilari stood, slowly, pressing one hand to the stone to steady herself. "Because I remember things they were designed to erase. I carry echoes of their beginning and their end." "You mean history?" Kyle asked. She shook her head. "I mean what they fear. I am the last light of a thought they couldn't control." No one spoke for a moment. Then Kale stepped forward. "Then we protect you." Ilari blinked. "You don't have to. We already are." The next sound came not from the ridge but from just outside the entrance. A single, sharp thud. Then another. Footsteps. Rex raised his rifle, Lyra lifted a flare. Kale moved to Ilari's side. "Can you still summon that shield?" She hesitated. "I can, but it won't last." "Then make it count." Ilari closed her eyes. Light spread from her fingers, slow at first, then faster, sweeping across the interior of the cave like water that burned instead of boiled. The air grew warmer. Kale felt his heartbeat in sync with the hum of her energy. A dome of silver blue wrapped around them, pulsing, alive. The wall at the front exploded. 3 creatures stormed through, taller than before, with longer limbs and spines of black glass. They moved faster now, evolved. As if the first encounter had been reconnaissance, and this was meant to end it. Rex fired first. 1 blast. 2. The third went wide. Lyra threw a flare. Light and heat sent one creature staggering, but the others pressed forward. Kyle stood his ground. Ilari's shield held, but only barely. The edges flickered. Sparks snapped off her fingers. Her face twisted in concentration. Blood leaked from her nose. Kale turned to her. "Let me help." "You can't." He reached out anyway, taking her hand. The moment they touched, the shield grew brighter. A hum filled the space, low, harmonic, like music played beneath the skin. One of the creatures tried to breach the light again. This time, the shield lashed back, hard. The creature screeched and collapsed. Rex whooped. "That's more like it." But Kale could feel her pulse racing. "It's killing you," he whispered. "I know," she said. He didn't let go. Neither did she. The second creature tried to flank. Lyra met it with a makeshift torch, blinding it long enough for Rex to land a shot straight through its neck. The third didn't attack. It stopped, watched, then spoke. Not in sound, in thought. Ilari's eyes widened. "They're learning. They're choosing." Kale frowned. "What?" "They're becoming more like us." The creature took 1 step forward. The shield cracked. Kale stepped in front of her. "We don't fall today." He raised his last flare and jammed it into the ice, lighting the entire cave in searing white. The creature recoiled, screamed, and vanished into the snow. Silence followed. Only the crackling of ice and Ilari's ragged breath remained. The shield collapsed. Kyle caught her as she fell. Her skin was cold again, but she was smiling. "You didn't run," she whispered. "Neither did you." The storm had stilled. Not because it was over, but because the enemy was no longer outside. It was here. Kyle could feel it in his spine. The weight in the air, the trembling of the cave walls, the low pulse that came not from Ilari this time, but from whatever hunted her. The ice wasn't cold now. It was tense, like a breath held just before a scream. Rex sat near the entrance, eyes bloodshot, rifle across his knees. The flare burns on his coat were fading, and his voice had gone quiet. Even he had stopped joking. Lyra was crouched beside Ilari, who lay wrapped in every blanket they had. Her eyes were closed, her face pale as the frost beneath her. The light inside her, faint gold threads that once danced under her skin, had dimmed to embers. She's fading, Lyra whispered. Kale knelt beside them. Can you stabilize her? Lyra shook her head. She's not human. I don't even know what normal looks like for her. Kyle brushed a hand gently over Ilari's forehead. Her skin was cold, but it didn't feel like death. It felt like something waiting. Suddenly, Ilari's fingers twitched. Then her eyes opened. And for a moment, just a breath, he saw stars in them. I dreamed, she whispered. Kyle leaned closer. What did you see? Her lips trembled. The last one who carried the light. He died alone. I felt his memory calling me. Kyle didn't understand it all, but he saw the fear in her eyes. I won't let that happen, he said. You might not have a choice, Rex said quietly, glancing back from the entrance. They're coming, and they're not hiding anymore. Outside, the snow had turned a strange color. Orange. Faint blue streaks pulsed across the horizon. Something huge was approaching, its silhouette broken and slow, but certain. Every crunch of ice it made felt like a countdown. Kale stood. Then we stand. He helped Ilari sit up. Can you still use it? The light? She looked down at her hands. Yes, but if I burn what's left, I may not wake again. Kyle looked at Lyra, then Rex. They both nodded. If you fall, Kyle said, we'll catch you. Ilari met his eyes, and for the first time she smiled. Small. Real. Hopeful. Kyle helped her to her feet. She stood weakly, legs trembling, light barely visible under her skin. Then she stepped outside the cave. The cold hit her like a wave, but she didn't flinch. Kyle, Lyra, and Rex followed. They saw it then. A towering beast, dark crystal, long limbs, face like a shard of mirror, reflecting everything and nothing. It stood still, as if considering them. Behind it, 3 more approached slowly, their shapes less solid, like shadows pretending to be alive. They're not just machines, Lyra whispered. No, Ilari said. They were made from thoughts, from fear. They hunt what doesn't fit. Kale raised his rifle. Then let's remind them what doesn't break. The lead creature moved. Fast. Kale fired. No effect. Rex launched a flare, too slow. The creature lunged, and Ilari screamed, not from pain, from release. Her body lit up, brilliant, radiant, white gold fire bursting from her chest, her hands, her eyes. The energy surged forward, striking the creature mid-charge. It howled, a sound that cracked the sky and staggered back, limbs melting into mist. But the power didn't stop. The second and third creatures charged. Ilari turned, arms wide, light burning through the snow like dawn across water. They vanished before reaching her. But so did her strength. She dropped to her knees, hands trembling. Kale ran to her, catching her before she fell. He held her close, felt her heartbeat flicker against his chest. I'm still here, she whispered. I know, Kale said, voice thick. The fourth creature stepped forward. Kale stood, shielding her. The beast stopped. Its mirrored face flickered, then turned, slowly, and walked away. One by one, the others followed. Gone. The snow fell again. Software light. Harmless. Kale looked down at Ilari. She was breathing, barely. Lyra touched his arm. She saved us. She saved more than that, Kale said. She chose us. And for the first time since the storm began, there was no sound, no threat, just snow, and fire still glowing inside someone who had no reason left to burn, but burned anyway. They did not speak for a long time. The storm had passed, the creatures had vanished, but in its place came a stillness too sharp to be peace. It was the kind of silence that follows after something has ended, but before anyone is brave enough to ask, what now? Ilari lay against the cave wall, her breathing shallow, her glow barely visible. Her body was drained, but her presence still felt like a star barely holding itself together. Kale sat beside her, cradling her in one arm, his jacket wrapped tight around her shoulders. He had not moved since the last light had faded from the snow. Lyra stood watch at the cave mouth, eyes scanning the ice field. The world was too bright, too still. Even Rex had fallen silent, seated with his back to the wall, staring at nothing with a look that had no words. Then, without warning, Ilari stirred. She sat up slowly, trembling, her eyes half-lidded but glowing once more. The warmth was back, not much but enough. Kyle looked at her, relief painted across his face. "Hey," she gave him a small smile. Then looked out to the horizon. "They'll return," she said. "Not soon, but they always return." Rex muttered, "Then we better move before they bring friends." But Ilari didn't respond. Instead, she stood, slowly, carefully, and stepped toward the center of the cave. She reached into the collar of her suit and pulled out a thin sliver of light, barely the size of a coin. It pulsed gently in her palm, emitting a soft resonance none of them had heard before. "What is that?" Lyra asked. "A key," Ilari whispered. "A failsafe. They implanted it long before I escaped." Kale stood, cautious. "Failsafe for what?" "For me." She placed the shard onto the frozen floor. It sank without a sound. Then the air split open like a sheet of paper being torn in slow motion. A gate appeared. Not wide, not violent. Just there. Warm light spilled through from the other side. Beyond it was another world. Not of snow. Not of pain. Something better. Somewhere she could be safe. Kyle stepped forward, his breath caught in his throat. "You can leave," he said. Ilari nodded. "I was never supposed to stay. My kind, we run. We survive. We do not attach." "But you did," Lyra said gently. Ilari looked at them. At the three humans standing before her. Scarred, worn, imperfect, and hers. "You gave me something I wasn't designed to believe in," she said softly. "Choice." She took a step toward the gate. Its light grew stronger. Rex exhaled. "Well, you earned it." Ilari turned to Kale. Her voice broke just slightly. "If I go through, I'm safe, I'm free." He nodded, his jaw tight. "Then go." But he didn't step back. Neither did Lyra. Neither did Rex. Ilari looked at all of them. "You would let me go," she said. "Even after everything." Lyra smiled, tired. "We didn't help you so you'd stay. We helped because someone had to." Cal stepped forward. "But I want you to stay." She looked into his eyes. The bond between them still pulsed. Quiet, gentle, alive. Then, she turned back to the gate, took one last step, and stopped. She raised her hand, then pressed 2 fingers to her own chest, then to Kale's, to Lyra's, to Rex's. "I stay," she whispered. The gate dimmed, then collapsed. Ilari turned, her shoulders shaking, her breath catching. Kale stepped toward her. She fell into his arms, not from exhaustion, from decision. The first rays of morning crept across the horizon like cautious fingers searching for something still breathing. The ice no longer howled. It glittered, cracked, shifted under the light, not in warning, but in welcome. The storm was gone. Kyle stood just outside the cave, arms folded, his breath rising in soft clouds against the still air. The snow stretched endlessly before him, sculpted by the wind into shapes that no longer felt cruel. For the first time in days, he could see the sky, pale, vast, silent. Behind him, Ilari stepped forward. She did not glow now. She simply was. No longer the girl buried under ice. No longer the hunted being, trembling with light and fear. Her steps were steady, her eyes clear. She walked like someone who had stopped running from herself. Kyle turned as she approached. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. Beside the fire, Lyra stirred, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she leaned into Rex's shoulder. Rex, still wrapped in 2 layers of thermal gear and grumbling even in sleep, blinked once at the sunrise, then smiled quietly to himself. It was over, or at least, this part was. Ilari reached out and touched the edge of the cave wall. Her fingers brushed the rock lightly, as if saying goodbye. Then she stepped fully into the light. Her skin shimmered, but not with power. With life. Kyle stood beside her. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. Ilari nodded slowly. "One day." "And what will you do?" She looked at him. "I won't hide again." Kyle's lips curved into a quiet smile. "Good, because I think we've got more to build than just barricades." Lyra joined them, arms crossed against the cold, smiling softly. "So," she said, "we're really doing this?" "Doing what?" Rex mumbled, emerging behind her, bleary-eyed. "This," Lyra said, motioning to the world. "Starting something, together." Rex shrugged. "Hell, I've done dumber things with worse people." Ilari turned to all three of them. "You are not worse," she said. "You were the first. The first to stay. The first to protect without expecting anything back. The first to believe." Kyle reached into his pack, pulling out a small beacon, damaged, but flickering. He tossed it into the snow and stomped the ice down around it. A signal. A new kind of signal. "We'll call it in," he said. "Let them know we're alive. Let them know something changed here." Ilari nodded. "And let them wonder why." Kyle turned to her. "You could have left. Why did you stay?" Ilari looked toward the sunrise and answered simply, "Because I wanted to see what came after." The sun climbed higher. And on that frozen world, once a grave, once a prison, 4 figures stood together. Not a team. Not survivors. Family. What would you become if someone believed in you before you believed in yourself? Would you melt the ice around your heart, or stay buried waiting for someone to dig you out? Leave a comment below, because sometimes all it takes is one moment of light, one hand refusing to let go, and everything begins again.